Welcome to another episode of Island Echoes, the podcast where we delve into the pressing issues affecting the Cayman Islands. Today, we're delving into a critical topic that impacts all of us: public transportation in the Cayman Islands. Our discussion will revolve around three main questions: how do we get here? What could it be? And what's holding us back? To help us unpack these questions, and just to keep things interesting, we do have two Matthews on the podcast today. I would like to introduce our guests, Matthew Elphinstone and Matthew Feitelberg.
Hi guys, my name's Matthew Feitelberg. I was born and raised in the Cayman Islands and went to school there, but I've spent most of my life now off the island. I work at the moment as an environmental designer and I have a background in architecture. I studied my undergrad at the University of the West of England in architecture and environmental engineering, and my master's at the University of Cambridge in architecture and urban design, where my thesis was about coastal resilience in small islands and climate change.
Hi, my name is Matthew Elphinstone, the other Matt. I have a degree in mechanical engineering and I do hardware design on island. I was also born and raised here, and I have an interest in public transportation, and I wish it was more usable on island.
Both Matthews are ambassadors at Sustainable Cayman, working tirelessly to promote sustainability in our islands. Plus, a fun fact, Matthew Elphinstone is the man behind the production of each episode, making sure to get out to you on the airwaves smoothly. So if you're enjoying this podcast, you have him to thank for it. Let's kick things off by addressing the first question: how did we get here? Understanding how we ended up with this current traffic and transportation situation requires a look into the historical and cultural evolution of the Cayman Islands. In the early days, transportation in the Cayman Islands was primarily seafaring. As a maritime nation, boats were the lifeline of our communities, facilitating trade, travel, communication between the islands and the wider Caribbean region. The sea was our highway, and every Caymanian had some connection to seafaring, whether through fishing, shipping, or transport. As the islands developed, there was a gradual shift towards land-based transportation. Bicycles became more a common mode of transportation, especially in the mid-century. Cycling was not only an affordable means of getting around, but also aligned with the laid-back community-focused lifestyle of the time. Roads were less congested and the pace of life was slower. However, in the latter half of the 20th century, the Cayman Islands experienced a rapid economic growth, driven largely by tourism and the financial services industry. This growth brought prosperity, but also significant changes in our lifestyle and infrastructure needs. Increase in affluence made car ownership more accessible, and the government's infrastructure projects focused on road development to support this shift. By the 1980s and 90s, cars had become the dominant mode of transportation. The allure of convenience and the status associated with car ownership accelerated this trend. Public transportation remained limited, and the growing population's reliance on cars led to the expansion of roads and the construction of new highways. This period marked the beginning of our current car-centric culture. The car-centric approach was further entrenched by policies and urban planning decisions that prioritized road construction over public transport development. The Public Transport Unit, responsible for licensing various transport operators, was once part of the Ministry of Tourism. This fragmentation in governance reflected a broader trend of treating transportation as an afterthought rather than a central component of our infrastructure strategy. While in contrast, Bermuda's Ministry of Transport emphasizes the importance of public transport as a vital service for both residents and tourists. Bermuda has implemented a highly regulated public transportation system, including buses and ferries, aimed at reducing car usage and alleviating traffic congestion. The ministry ensures that the public transport system is reliable, affordable, and efficient, serving the dual purpose of providing residents with essential mobility, enhancing the visitor experience by making travel across island convenient and enjoyable. Recently, the Cayman Islands has turned to Bermuda for insights and collaboration on public transportation solutions. Despite these efforts, traffic congestion remains prevalent across the region. The key difference lies in how these countries manage the cost and revenue of public transportation. In Bermuda, the government subsidizes their public transportation system to keep fares affordable and ensure frequent service. This approach aims to balance cost recovery with public service. Barbados, on the other hand, is exploring sustainable funding models that could include public-private partnerships to enhance efficiency and service quality. Thank you both for coming on today's podcast. We have a lot to cover with this topic, so let's get right into it. Where we stand today and what is currently in progress, what could public transport be?
So the conversation around public transit is really interesting, and I want to sort of start off with a slight caveat, because it can be kind of difficult to discuss this as a broader topic. And that's because public transport is sort of seen sometimes as a bit of a silver bullet for all of the problems associated with modern urban life. And although it is true that a modern, efficient, reliable, and affordable public transportation system is a benefit to all, or at least I believe it is, it really needs to be implemented with other urban design and development plans that support and encourage the population to take transit. So oftentimes, implementing good bus routes is not enough. You have to consider other angles as well. So, with that said, I want to talk a bit about a sort of local hero, somebody I consider to be a local hero, who I'm sure most of you remember, Mr. Burns Connolly. Mr. Connolly was the first architect in Cayman to be registered with the AIA, that's the American Institute of Architects, and is well known for designing Camana Bay. That's probably his most famous project, which, despite what some of us may think about the people who run it, I think we can all agree is a beautiful piece of tropical architecture and urban design. So about 6 months ago, I was doing a research project on transport and driving in Cayman and came across Mr. Connolly's master's thesis from the University of Texas at Austin that he wrote in 1986. And he discussed his ideas for the development of Georgetown. He called it the urban renewal of Georgetown. And he does mainly focus on the historic town center, but he does periodically mention how it can be developed in tandem with the rest of the island. And one of his major points is the need for a proper public transport system. And he talks about the traffic even back then and how during rush hour, it's really, really heavy in Georgetown. I think that's something that we can all relate to. Now, he does not talk about traffic on the rest of the island. So obviously, this has sort of reached an extreme level that probably he would never have thought could have happened. So this conversation about public transit on the island is not new. It's been going on for, nearly 40 years. Now, by our standards, his proposal for a public transit network are probably relatively weak, but at the time it would have been a radical departure from what Caymanians were used to. So he recommended implementing a bus network that stretched through town and into the outer districts, and that ran during the morning and evening commute time, so about 4 o'clock to 7 o'clock, and about 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock, as well as during the lunch hours. He recommended sort of small vans, 10 to 15, maybe 20 people, sort of quite similar to what we have now, and central bus depots in the outer districts, so Bontown, West Bay, North Side, and East End, that people would drive to, park at, and then take public transit into town, into Georgetown. So essentially a park and ride. Now, like I said, at the time, his proposal would have been pretty radical. And we can actually say that some of what he proposed has been achieved because we do have a public transit network. It's not perfect, but we do have one, and it crisscrosses the island and it provides relatively reliable service. And all of that is good things. We should not sort of take away from that fact. But it does not serve the population that we have now. Yeah, so moving forward, I think when considering the future of Cayman's public transport, the hardest part is how to convince people to use it. So the simple answer, the short answer, is to make transport easier and quicker than driving. Fine, okay? Easy enough to say and easy enough to make a statement like that. Achieving it is far more difficult. The way that I see it, the way forward includes a variety of options, all which need to be implemented simultaneously. So this process could include something a series of options along the lines of upgrades to the buses themselves, upgrades to the infrastructure, so bus stops, etc., upgrades to the road infrastructure, changes and developments in costs of tickets, the introduction of other methods of transport, as well as a reimagining and shift away from car-centric urban design, which is a bit of a broader issue, and I'll kind of touch on that at the end because it's a relatively large problem in Cayman that is not fixed by sort of simple legislature. So if we start with the buses themselves, they're kind of lackluster at best and bad at worst. We've all taken them. They're not great. They could be better. So although they do provide frequent and relatively reliable service, they're not accessible, although there is a service that provides accessible transport for people in wheelchairs or people of less mobility. The general bus system is not accessible. So investment in a fleet of new, modern, air-conditioned, and really importantly, low-floor buses with ramps is a necessity. Not only would this make long journeys across the island far more comfortable for everybody, but a modern fleet of buses with ramps and low floors would mean people of limited mobility would no longer need to rely on these private services or on their family to drive them around. It allows for greater independence for a vast majority of the country.
Yeah, and it's like doing that type of accessibility in public transportation makes it so that it is normal to be able to go around and be independent and do what they need, their everyday tasks in their lives, right?
Exactly. It builds independence, and Cayman is one of the few places where the standard buses are not accessible. In most places in the world, they all have ramps. It's just a way of life. It's not considered anything particularly glamorous. If you get on a bus, you can get on it if you're in a wheelchair, if you have a cane, if you're blind, if you're whatever.
And a part of that as well is that it is, and I'm sure you'll get onto it, is that the reliability and how consistent the service is to be able to use it.
Absolutely. Yeah, so going on, bus stops themselves, again, pretty lackluster. Where I am in Bodden Town, they're really nothing more than signs by the side of the road. You would barely know there was a bus stop there if you weren't a local. And that is kind of indicative of the stops in most of the outer districts, not so much in Georgetown, but at least in Bodden Town, East End and North Side. So part of the process of convincing people to take the bus would actually be making these stops more beautiful, which sounds a bit odd, but why shouldn't public transit be beautiful? Creating these modern, shaded, well-lit and safe bus stops that can operate into the night as well, that aren't dangerous places for women and children to wait for the bus when it's dark out, is really, really important, as well as integrating these stops with surrounding pedestrian infrastructure. So super basic things like sidewalks, crosswalks. You could build restaurants, cafes, little offices, whatever you wanted that create more of a community around these bus stops, particularly in places like Bodden Town and East End and North Side, where people are much more used to driving. So it creates a community around taking public transit as opposed to something that, just other people do, but you're going to drive. Then changes to the roads themselves. So if buses are to compete with cars, they have to travel faster than them. It is as simple as that. It has to be quicker to take the bus from wherever you are in East End or West Bay or wherever into town. And part of that process would mean creating dedicated bus lanes throughout all of the major roads on the island that only buses are allowed to travel in. And it's kind of a bit of a jarring statement because in the short term, it would cause chaos. It would cause absolute chaos. I am well aware of that. Traffic would be crazy. It would be really hard. However, in the long term, if you're a driver and you're sitting in traffic and then you see a bus fly past you full of people, you will be convinced eventually that, oh, actually, maybe this is a way better way for me to get into the office than sitting in my car for an hour and a half, on the middle of a highway. And so that is, I think, one of the kind of most important ways that we can make public transit better in Cayman. There's also an interesting discussion to be had around price. In most places in the world, there are various different ticket fares based on who you are, based on your age, if you're a student, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's actually really important for a place like Cayman. So you could imagine young people, say under 18s or under 16s, having free public transport, and older people, let's say oldest over 60 or over 65, also having free public transport. And you could have subsidized public transport if you go to university or if you're a high school, whatever. And so you have all these different prices, which particularly for young people and for older people create way more independence. If you are under 17 and you can't drive yet, well, then you can get on the bus for free and it makes your life a lot easier. Also, going forward, it creates a culture of young people who are used to taking public transit, which, I mean, certainly growing up in Cayman, I wasn't. And I wasn't used to taking public transit until I moved to Canada. And it took a while to kind of get on that system. So I think providing an accessibility in terms of cost is really, really important. Number 5, I promise I'm almost finished. Alternative options. So any modern public transport system needs to rely on more than just one option. So right now we only have buses. It needs to expand. Part of that expansion would be things like ferries, bikes, maybe even trams. I mean, that might be a bit of a pipe dream, but it could be fascinating to see trams in Cayman. I know there is a ferry service at the moment that travels between Cayman Bay and Rum Point, and I think it's an amazing idea. Right now, I don't think it's working properly, and I think part of that is because it's sort of focused on tourists and as a piece of tourist infrastructure. It's these open-backed boats that are, sure, lovely, but if you're going to work, you're going to be a complete mess by the time you get to Cayman Bay. And they don't really fit in with the rest of the public transport infrastructure. So if you're living in Northside and you drive to the ferry port terminal in Rum Point, unless you work in Cayman Bay, you're kind of screwed. So sure, you can get to Cayman Bay, but what if you need to get somewhere else in West Bay or Georgetown? So that service needs to be integrated with the bus network and integrated with maybe a potential bike network, a series of bike highways going through the island that are shaded and protected from cars. Then you could have public electric bikes like we do in London, like there are in Toronto, like there are in New York, that make actually cycling a lot easier, particularly because of the heat. So all of these different strands of public transit, they can't work separately. They need to be integrated with each other. To do, for example, with cycling in Toronto, the buses have cycle racks on the front of them. So you can cycle to a bus stop, put your bike on the front of the bus, get on the bus, go wherever you need to go, and then get off the bus and take your bike and cycle somewhere else. And one could see that basically being a sort of park and ride situation like Mr. Connolly recommended, except it's with bikes instead of with cars. Therefore, it's better for the environment, it's better for the roads, better for exercise, it's kind of better for everything. And I will promise not to be, I need to be a bit careful, like I mentioned, about saying that public transit's a silver bullet for everything. But, it would make life great, I think. And lastly, like I mentioned, sort of urban design and a shift in urban design. This is part of a much wider issue that could easily be an entire series. So I'm not going to go into this really deeply. But the overarching issue essentially that Cayman faces right now is that it has developed largely around the automobile. So therefore, most of our infrastructure is built not for people, but for cars. So for example, in this research project that I was doing before in central Georgetown, which let's define, say, as the area between the port, Shedden Road, and Mary Street, which is an area of about 0.225 square kilometers or about 0.086 square miles, about a quarter of the space is dedicated to parking, which is kind of insane. And that's just parking. So when you change that metric to include space dedicated to automobiles, so roads, parking, et cetera, the figure is over a third, which is insane. That is a third of our historic district dedicated to cars, not to people. So I'm not saying that we need to get rid of all of the roads, but for a good public transit network to work, that needs to be changed. And having a good public transit network would allow all of those, let's say, parking spaces to be used for other things, for the public good. It could be parks, it could be apartments, public buildings, bars, restaurants, whatever you want, but it would open up that space for other opportunities, whether it be public or commercial.
That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
It's honestly crazy to hear that 1/3 of Georgetown is dedicated to parking. I mean, you can go to town and see it, right? But it's just like when you quantify it, it's just that's insane.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, when I was doing that project, I was like, wow, because if it's quite easy to see on a map, but like when you actually get those numbers and I did a kind of interesting visual. That was just, instead of having all the different parking spots, just having a line showing how much is parking and how much area would be parking and how much area would be building. And it's insane. I mean, like 1/3 of the land is an enormous amount of land.
Yeah.
For cars.
And when you do that and commit to doing that, being so car centric, you're compromising with green space. And you're going to ultimately make Georgetown have a microclimate that is a lot warmer than it could be by using, better urban design, better density, but also more parks, more trees, and shade, right?
And I mean, actually, Mr. Connolly talked about this a lot. This was kind of his end vision, was actually this master plan of central Georgetown, which was really quite beautiful, but that he essentially went and created in Cayman Bay. And if you look at what his proposal was for Georgetown, it's really similar to what eventually was built by DART. And, he kind of eventually got his 2 cents, I guess you could say, but he was never able to see his true vision come to life, which is quite sad because, Cayman Bay, for all of its merits, is a private, enclosed development. It's not integrated with the rest of the island. It's not meant to be integrated with the rest of the island. That's kind of not how they designed it, for better or for worse. And so it's kind of sad that, we can clearly build like that. We can clearly build like beautiful, dense, green, lush places. We're just choosing not to.
Yeah, and it still needs parking lots because we don't have a bus system.
Exactly.
Which leads us to the point that I did my research on. What's the holdup? I read through the Deloitte's public transport strategy report for my main research, and I feel like it can be quantified into 3 main roadblocks. Firstly, the responsibility of transportation has been divided into 3 different departments. Secondly, public transportation is treated like a business instead of a public service. And thirdly, the lack of any real cohesive vision from the government. So transportation has always been treated as an afterthought. The role has been really divided into 3 sections. Like, you got the NRA, the National Roads Authority, that does the roads, the DVDL that does the vehicle licensing, and then the public transport unit that licenses taxis, tour buses, omnibuses, school buses, and even water sport operators. Now, traditionally, the PTU used to be a part of the Ministry of Tourism. So it kind of tells you the incentives that, like, it is built to handle tourists, right? And it's also, when looking into the Deloitte report, the other section that it's primarily built for is expats that can't afford vehicles. To give credit where credit's due, the government is considering combining them into one Department of Transportation. In November 2023, the Planning, Agriculture, Housing, and Infrastructure Minister, Johnny J. Ebanks, was given the transportation portfolio. This will put all of the departments under one roof. Merging this into one department is essential, as it would make it possible to implement holistic transport policies. Like, The NRA adding bus lanes is not going to be useful if there isn't buses every 15 minutes during peak hours. The current ban on 11-year-old cars is not going to help if, because people are just going to buy 10-year-old cars unless there is a viable transport alternative. A bus system is not going to be useful if there's no bus shelters, probably solar air conditioned ones that the NRA has to implement into their road layouts. This type of coordination is necessary to solve our transport issues. So it's a good step forward that they are planning to merge it into one department. However, they're one step back as the government intends to make it run like a business. Treating public transportation, where it must be profitable at all costs, is not effective when you're aiming for a mass adoption. Businesses don't even follow that rule. Just look at Uber, for example, that finally became profitable in 2023. When you want to dominate a market, you need to take losses, and ultimately, this is going to lower transport costs for the average Canadian. Quote, prices that need to be more affordable than owning private vehicles and possibly free initially in order to encourage utilization and inspire changed behavior, from the Deloitte report. For Cayman to move forward in a mass transit system, the government needs to make a large investment so that it is accessible, convenient, and comfortable. Drivers should get paid an hourly wage instead of by passenger. And we need an abrupt change to the 30-year-old Toyota vans that we're used to. This leads us to the last issue, the government's lack of cohesive vision. The Deloitte Public Transport Strategy report lays out two frameworks for a transportation system. In brief, option 1 is a government-run service that directly competes with the current omnibuses. Option 2 has the public bus service only go between sub-depots and private buses do the last mile. The main issue of incorporating private operators is that it makes it difficult to make a service that provides a consistent experience. As previously mentioned, the current type of omnibuses are not up to modern standards, and the operators have no incentive to upgrade them. The report says route completion is a common complaint among users, not being effective enough to use for their daily commutes. Having a hodgepodge of public and private transit systems will make it highly difficult to schedule routes and to enforce them.
Yeah, and I think there are very few places in the world where there are actually truly private public transit systems, because the nature of that makes no sense. A private public transit system, it's completely contradictory. And so you either, if you are coming from a government perspective, pay off people or say, this is it now, this is the way going forward, we will run the public transport system. It's as simple as that. Or it is a partnership. And I don't think there's any other way that Cayman can really go forward.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yet there is a fear of going into full competition, is apparent from this paragraph. Once agreed, changes to the current public bus system are announced by the CIG. It is responsible to expect that each private operator will evaluate the impact of the announced changes would have on their businesses and respond accordingly. The government will therefore have to ensure that the response from the private operators is carefully managed, as it is critical for the existing services to be maintained until the government service is implemented. As a result, a level of intervention may be required by the government to ensure the desired outcome. In short, they're saying that they need to pay out the private bus operators to keep doing it until they can get the buses there. This ultimately contributes to the indecisiveness the government is facing, unable to make any fundamental changes in order to protect the business interests of a few. This decision paralysis to compromise with stakeholders whose interest directly opposes everyone else's will lead to a transit system that works for no one.
Yeah, I think that's a really sort of interesting way to wrap that up, because I think we all agree that something needs to be done, and paralysis is a really good word for what we're kind of experiencing right now. And we either move forward making decent decisions surrounding public transport, or we keep going the way we are going, and Cayman will lose out and be more clogged on traffic than it has ever been before. And that will eventually lead to our downfall if nobody can get anywhere. If you can't drive to your office in less than 2 hours, that's going to make Cayman way less desirable as a place to live, a place to do business. So this lack of public transit will eventually suffocate us.
And the report mentions a lot about how this is like one of the main benefits is the worker productivity, because Deloitte is a business on island. It has a lot of employees, and it needs people to get to work on time and be productive. So even the business community understands the necessity of just having it all under one roof, and having something that can be scheduled effectively.
Yeah, I guess it is kind of capitalism as a means for social change,
right?
Which is sort of problematic in its own right, but if it makes things better, I suppose who are we to argue?
Who are we to judge?
Does anyone have any last remarks?
If they don't make a bus, I'll cry.
If they don't make a bus, we'll cry.
I'll cry so hard.
And we'll just swim to work in our own tears.
The bus can swim.
The bus can swim.
I believe they call those boats.
Okay, that's been amazing. Like, you guys had dropped so much information and like shared such wonderful insights on this huge problem that we have in Cayman, which is traffic congestion, as well as like reform to our public transportation system. And I hope you, the listeners, had some takeaway from this, that after listening to this episode, like, you sit and think and ponder of what can I do, or like how can I have action be enacted. And this is where we ask you, the listeners, to contact your MPs, share your thoughts, share in this podcast. Of course, we don't have all the solutions, but what Matthew F had to share and what Matthew E had to share, I think is at least a step in the right direction, so that our public transport is accessible, affordable, effective, to ensuring that we are targeting all the people who need it most. But at the end of it all, like, we're all going to end up using it at some point, and it's something that is necessary for any developing nation to have a functional public transport, either for capitalistic gains or either just for social good. With that being said, thank you both for coming onto the podcast. It has been a pleasure, and hope to see you next time. Matthew F, when you're back on island.
Yeah, and thank you guys for letting me sort of have my 2 cents and say my opinions.
Yeah, same here. Always good to be on it. Hope the editing goes well.
Yes. Is this current Matthew telling future Matthew, like, you're gonna have some work?
I may cut it or not.
Thank you, Matthews, for joining this month's episode and sharing your valuable insights. And of course, I want to thank you, the listeners, for tuning in to another episode of Island Echoes. For you curious minds, all sources from this month's episode will be in the description. If you value public transportation, be sure to contact your MP and share your thoughts. If you would like to get involved with Sustainable Cayman, or if you would like to support our podcast, you can email us at ambassador@sustainablecayman.org. For real-time updates and engaging content, you can also follow us on Instagram at SustainableKY, on Facebook at sustainable.cayman, and on TikTok at SustainableCayman.